Aaron Goldberg, how are you?
Great. How you doing?
I'm pretty good. It's good to see you again. Let me introduce us. I am Josh Summers, and this is Meaning of Life TV, and you are Aaron Goldberg. Before I discuss your professional compliments, I'm just going to say that I knew you 25 years ago. We were in high school together. We overlapped for about a year then. And in the intervening 25 years, you have gone on to become one of the most in-demand jazz pianists on the planet. You work as a band leader with your own groups and also as a collaborator with notable names such as Joshua Redman, Wynton Marsalis, Kurt Rosenwinkel, Guillermo Klein, Al Foster, and Betty Carter, to name just a few folks you've worked with. You also have 5 records under your own name and many more as a collaborator, including a series that seems to be out of print called Baby Loves Jazz, which is a wonderful introduction to jazz for children under 6 or so. So we're going to be discussing today on Meaning of Life your career, your process as a jazz artist, the state of jazz today, where it's going. But maybe to start out, if we go way back to the early years, you, as I remember you, you had many opportunities open to you in terms of what you might do with your life. And I'm curious to hear now, what drew you in particularly about jazz? What was it about jazz that caught you and turned into this love affair?
First of all, thanks, Josh, for having me. It's pretty awesome to see you here in this new context and reconnect with you in this way. So I'm honored to be here. And I would say I never, when I first encountered jazz, I never imagined that I would make a career of being a jazz musician. I fell in love with jazz for aesthetic, social, personal, maybe you might use the word spiritual reasons. And I was never thinking that this was going to be my future and my profession. It was kind of like falling in love with another person at a very crucial age, young age. I was about 14, kind of in the throes of trying to figure out who I was. Identity issues tend to be important for all kids that age, and I was no exception. I guess sophomore year of high school, I discovered there was a jazz class being offered by my high school, our high school, and I knew nothing about jazz. I grew up playing classical music. It's one of the many things that I did as a little kid, and my parents listened to classical music, opera. Somehow they seem to have missed all rock music of the 60s and 70s as well as jazz. So I had no idea what improvisational music could be. All I knew was that I wanted to take a class that would give me credit for playing the piano. And that just seemed like an easy and fun way to break up my school day. And what changed my life was that the summer before this class, I received in the mail, we all received in the mail, a little cassette. This was back in the day of Maxell cassettes. And on that cassette, there were about 8 classic recordings, classic songs by jazz masters like Miles Davis, John Coltrane. And I didn't know what I was listening to, but there was a little note along with the cassette that said, "Summer homework for jazz students. Listen to this cassette." And I was a studious young man, so I did my homework. I listened to that cassette possibly thousands of times during the course of that summer. And I fell in love with what I was hearing without knowing the identity of the musicians, the racial, ethnic, cultural background of the musicians, what was improvised and what wasn't. I couldn't even distinguish the different instruments. But I felt the power of the music in some kind of elemental way, intuitive way. And I was, I didn't have music of my own. I didn't have a deep passion for the music that my friends were listening to, the pop music of the day. And I also wasn't deeply passionate about the classical music that I was playing, even though I was able to appreciate its beauty on some level. So this music hit me, moved me in a way that no music had up to that time. And I would even say the only thing that had hit me in a similar kind of way by age 14 were some books, some novels that I had read. But from an artistic standpoint, this was my first experience of some kind of communion, a feeling of communion with art, and that was enough to give me passion to try to figure out how to play this music. And I never ever thought that I could become good enough at it that I could make a living at it. I was not a particularly talented, jazz student at age 14. I had no improvisational experience at all, and all I knew was the basic skill for a classical pianist of turning notes on a page into sound. And I had a certain amount of technique, which gave me an ability to play my instrument well, but I didn't have any ear. I didn't have any ability to learn by ear. And the major difference between learning to play jazz and learning to play classical music is that jazz is best learned by ear. And I had to develop my ear from nothing. So I was at a relative disadvantage, maybe compared to some of the other students who had a little more background playing rock or blues. However, I was at a relative advantage because I had fallen in love with this cassette. So I had internalized, without realizing what I was doing, a certain amount of very basic jazz vocabulary during the course of that first summer and during the course of that first year. And the more I listened to jazz, the more I started to fill my brain with essentially like the basic building blocks of the jazz language as codified by the masters of this music. And by falling in love with what they were doing and kind of hearing this language all the time through a process of immersion, when I started to try to speak the language myself, I made a little bit of sense, in the way that a child speaker or even a baby, a toddler, starts to make sense in their native language very slowly but surely, and maybe finds themselves speaking basic sentences, after about 4 or 5 years. So that was me. I was just a child thrown into this new language, but loving every second of it.
In making that transition, that lateral transition from kind of a classically trained musician to a jazz musician, how did you? I mean, was it just listening itself that allowed you to navigate that transition? I mean, how did you get stuff from what you're hearing under your fingers?
So I have to give credit where credit is due. I was very, very fortunate to have an excellent first teacher who I want to name. His name is Bob Sinecrope. You know him yourself. And Bob Sinecrope, when he started teaching at our high school, he was a math teacher. He was a jazz bass player by night and a math teacher by day. And he, to his credit and to the credit of the school, transitioned from being a math teacher into being a full-time jazz teacher because he had a certain amount of pedagogical experience as a math teacher and a strong analytic ability. He had skills to become an excellent teacher at whatever he was teaching. But he'd also learned jazz in the organic fashion of basically learning the music, falling in love with it by ear, and figuring it out on his own. So he had the combination of the two sets of skills, pedagogical skills and analytical skills on the one hand, and then an ear-based organic ability to play this music and the realization, the deeply important realization that this is an oral tradition and needs to be taught in that fashion, which many professional jazz schools at a higher level, at the bachelor and master's level, still haven't figured out. So I had this very crucial first experience with how to learn this music that was not based on anything written on a page, anything written on a chalkboard. It was not based on chord scales. It was not based on anything overly technical. It was based around the idea that you listen, you imitate, you sing along with what you hear, and then you just try to play what you sing. So you're singing in your head melodies, and you're trying to play those melodies on your instrument. That's a skill that you develop by learning intervals and learning the sound of intervals and learning to play those intervals on your instrument. It's an ear-based skill set that's required. But the beauty of it is that you're sort of speaking through your instrument in the way that you speak basic English when you're a child. You say what you feel or what you think. The equivalent in jazz is that you sing a melody and you play that melody without necessarily knowing what notes you're playing or what are the right notes or the wrong notes. So there's certain kind of organic truth to this basic method of learning by ear.
You just mentioned, in going over that, you mentioned something about higher education in jazz, whether the bachelor program in jazz studies at the big music schools, how they haven't figured this out. I have a little bit of experience in that myself, and it does strike me that there's kind of this reverse engineering where you learn these highly sort of conceptual notions around chord structure, naming things, certain scales, and you try to put these things under your hands and be able to play them, but it doesn't actually get to this more elemental, as you're describing, this elemental way of just speaking and communicating through an instrument.
A nice analogy is the difference between learning a second language in a classroom and learning a second language as a child by immersion in a new country, or if you grow up bilingual with a parent who speaks one language and a parent who speaks another, you get both languages organically without ever learning any grammar.
Right.
It takes a lot longer, and you are much less likely to ever become an eloquent speaker of a second language if you try to take it up, say, in high school or college, in a classroom, learning the rules of grammar, the conjugations of each verb, the appropriate pronouns, and you never kind of get to that totally natural way that a kid speaks a language, after never having studied it in a classroom at all. So that's the proof already that the right way to learn is by ear. Of course, our brains are more plastic when we're young, so it's easier to pick up these things. It's a little bit more difficult to do it later, but it's still the right method. It's just a little slower. So I think that after you become a relatively natural speaker of a language, a second language, musical language in this case, it's useful to learn grammar. It's useful to learn, in this case, chord scales. You can play the flat 13 on the dominant chord heading towards the minor. This kind of technical language is useful if you already know what it sounds like. And if you learn to translate these numbers, these numerical relationships, into sound in the way that a really great conductor or even a really great jazz musician who has this kind of skill set can look at a piece of paper that's full of notes and hear the notes, not play them, but hear what's on the page. A great conductors, you could present them with this orchestral score of 60, 70 instruments written on a page, and they can say, oh, wow, this is good. Or, oh, no, this is crap. We don't need to play this with our orchestra. They don't, that's a kind of sight to sound skill set that great conductors learn that most jazz students never develop. So it's a waste to spend so much time and so much money teaching and learning all this technical ability if it's not translated into sound here.
Mm-hmm. So as you were going through that in your high school years and developing your ears, when was the switch flipped, and in the sense that you kind of felt that this was going to be the thing you're going to do, was it not a quick switch? It's more of a gradual wading into the pool, and suddenly you realize you're 6 feet in.
Good question. I think that for me in high school it was much more about developing a sense of identity. So, jazz was one of the few things that I loved that had nothing to do with my parents, my background, anything that was expected of me. So it felt truly mine, me, a part of who I was. There were some other things that I felt similarly about, but jazz was probably the most important at that period of time between 14 and 17. And I didn't have any intention or belief that it was even possible to make a living at it, but it was an integral part of my identity that I knew would be part of my life forever. Definitely as a listener, and hopefully also as a player at some level of ability. But what happened was that I realized that I didn't have to go to college right away. And there was a guy writing a book at our high school, another high school teacher writing a book about taking a year off between high school and college. And that was not something that I'd ever heard about, but I got lucky and heard about Mr. Gilpin's book. And the book was just in process. I never read the book, but I did have a conversation with him where I learned that actually this was starting to become rare but possible move for 17 or 18-year-old kids. And so I raised it as a possibility to my parents, and of course they shut it down fast. And because they shut it down fast, I was more and more determined to do it. So then it was just a question of what I was going to do with my year between high school and college. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it would be wise for me to spend my year doing only one thing, because up until that point in my life, I had always juggled many things. Like a lot of kids with kind of ambitious parents, I was supposed to be well-rounded, and so I was always trying to juggle various different activities along with school. And I thought it would be interesting to just focus on one thing. And the thing that I was most passionate about at the time was jazz. So the other goal of taking that year off, besides to focus my life a little bit, was to leave the house, leave my parents' house, and hopefully leave the town I grew up in. So I became more passionate about the idea of going to New York, and I enrolled in a place called the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music in Greenwich Village, 1991, which was an amazing period of time in New York because most of the old masters of this music were still with us, and you could go out every night and hear Freddie Hubbard and Joe Henderson and Betty Carter, and of course the Chick and Herbie, and it was also the kind of beginning of the second wave of the young lions bringing the so-called young lions bringing jazz back into the mainstream. So young, in other words, young musicians, mostly African American, but not solely, famously wearing suits and ties, playing, swinging, blues, let's say, I don't know, steeped blues music, steeped in the blues, if not, necessarily blues, and steeped in the deep traditions of African American jazz, back to the forefront. And so to speak, it was a little bit sidetracked in the 70s, sidelined, because of the fusion electric instruments and the music that was a mixture of jazz with popular music at the time. So there was a movement famously led by Wynton and then later Branford Marsalis to bring acoustic swinging jazz back, and also to try to get it accepted as American genius music. I don't necessarily like the word America's classical music, but that was a commonly thrown term at the time. And the real purpose of that, someone that knows Wynton well, was to give the great African American genius musicians, whose work he has famously trumpeted, no pun intended, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Thelonious Monk, Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Miles, their due, to give them credit in the halls of the elite cultural and musical institutions such as Carnegie Hall, such as Lincoln Center, to give these masterful genius musicians their due, even though, at the time they were treated as second-class citizens. And he's been phenomenally successful at that. I didn't realize at the time, but jazz in general was benefiting from that movement. Jazz clubs were, well attended. There was attention from large record companies, paid to young up-and-coming musicians. Record contracts were being given. There was tour support for young bands as well as older bands. And there, masters like Betty Carter and Joe Henderson had a chance to have a kind of career rebirth in the 1990s, which meant they were also hiring young musicians. And so you could hope, as a young and up-and-coming musician at the New School in 1991, 92, to get a gig playing with Betty Carter, playing with Joe Henderson, playing with Freddie Hubbard, playing with Hank Jones, playing with Barry Harris, playing with Herbie and Chick, and this was suddenly there was a career path that kind of opened to me when I was placed in this environment of other people who were, aspiring to be professional musicians, and I had never been around anybody who was aspiring to be a professional musician. And I was suddenly surrounded by people from all over the world, my age and a little bit older, who had that aspiration. And what I was surprised to discover, at least after the first semester of working really hard, I wasn't that much worse than them. In fact, I was actually probably better than some of them. Of course, there were also people that were way, way better than I was at the time. I mean, famous musicians like Brad Mehldau and Roy Hargrove, they were students at the New School at the time, although they didn't show up for class that often. But I had amazing students, a little bit older and more experienced than me, who served as role models, and also, but equally important, ironically, people that were aspiring and were confident they would make a living as jazz musicians who I felt like were not actually that great, or at least were not that much better than me. So I realized it was possible. And then things got complicated because I'd never really taken it seriously as a career possibility before. And then, if my parents came down hard on the idea of going to music school for 1 year, they were definitely going to come down even harder on the idea of going to music school for 4 years, or just dropping out of music school and trying to make a living as a jazz musician in New York in 1992. So anyway, that's the answer to your question about when it suddenly occurred to me that it might be possible. But I had to make a kind of compromise with my parents, and I ended up going to Harvard and studying philosophy and psychology, but playing all the time with musicians that went to Berklee School of Music, Berklee College of Music, New England Conservatory, and I also studied with a second great teacher in Boston named Jerry Bergonzi, and I started to play in his band and in the band of a lot of well-established Boston musicians, and I spent my summers in New York staying in contact with my New York musician friends, and I sort of slowly built my career while I was in college.
So while you were in college,
yeah,
I live in Boston, so I know the area, and you were basically in Cambridge, Harvard Square by day, taking classes, taking the bus down Mass Ave into Back Bay to the Berklee College of Music at night.
That is absolutely right. Sometimes in the afternoons, sometimes very late at night. I mean, I would do recording sessions at 2 a.m. when the studios were free and everybody had free studio time. And I was also playing at a great club called Wally's, which
Yep.
where most of the musicians that passed through Boston, including people like Branford Marsalis and Roy Hargrove, played every night or weekends at Wally's Cafe, going all the way back to the 30s. So Wally himself was still alive at the time. He was close to 100. And I played at Wally's almost every weekend, first starting on Sunday afternoons and then Friday and Saturday nights from 9 until 2 in the morning for the grand sum of $15, with amazing young musicians from Berklee College of Music, who I still play with today. People like Reuben Rogers and Jacques Schwartzbart, Melvin Butler, a great saxophone player back in the day named Teodros Avery, my friend Jimmy Green, who used to come up from Hartford to play with us, Darren Barrett, fantastic trumpet player, Jeremy Pelt. We all kind of grew up playing at Wally's. John Lampkin was the drummer. And that was, my outlet, my musical outlet for most of the time I was in college. And I was just juggling the two lives, and they were surprisingly complementary. Sometimes my sleep suffered, but it was
from a time and management, logistical, so many hours in a day perspective. It seems almost superhuman to be able to pull that off. Given that, at least I just saw on Wikipedia that you graduated magna cum laude from Harvard.
Well, if you first of all, most of the kids that end up in those kind of institutions have a certain amount of juggling skills already. In order to get into those kind of schools, most of the kids, graduate high school not only having done well in their classes, but also having some like extracurricular activities. Hopefully they didn't just do them in order to try to get into college, but hopefully they actually had some passion for the extracurricular activities that they do. And one thing, is someone that also attended, good universities, like while you're in college, it's not as if everybody's sitting around all day and just studying. You have a certain contingent of people that are partying all the time. You have another contingent of people that are playing a varsity sport. You have another contingent of people that are, involved in community service. And most people in college are doing something else besides just studying. And for me, that other thing happened to be jazz. Now, the good thing about my sort of second career was that it also paid me money, so which allowed me to live, a better life than I would have. And it was also like the beginning of a career, which I wasn't thinking in any kind of careerish kind of way, but I wanted to keep my musical skills up, and there just weren't enough good jazz musicians attending Harvard, that I could have had enough people to play with.
Oh.
And I feel that the most important thing I could do in order to improve, especially as a pianist, what we call a rhythm section player, piano, bass, drums, guitar, someone who can play in many bands, can accompany many people, and needs a certain kind of social musical environment in order to develop. The most important thing I could do was not practice in a practice room, but play with great musicians. And I'd learned that already at the new school, and I put that into practice while I was at Harvard. I just played as much as I could with as many good musicians as I could. And every time you play with somebody good and they like your playing, that's another contact. That's some person who's going to potentially call you for a gig if they get a gig. And your career is kind of underway based on all the musical connections that you make. Not for networking purposes, just for musicianship development purposes. And it translates into a career in the long run.
So when you came out of college, what was the first break you got?
So I moved immediately to New York. I'd gotten my degree. My parents were happy about that. And I was now 22 years old, and I felt like it was time to just do what I wanted to do. So I moved to New York. I was fortunate because many of my friends my musician friends from Berkeley and New England Conservatory also moved to New York around the same time. And I had stayed in touch with all my new school friends who had now graduated. And so you had this whole mass of young musicians who were starting their careers at the same time. And I got a lot of opportunities through those people, mostly young musicians, people who are no longer young, but fellow young musicians, people like Greg Tardy, Omer Avital, Ali Jackson, Mark Turner, fantastic saxophone player. I started to play in the bands of those friends of mine. And I started my own band also in the mid to late 90s with Reuben Rogers and Eric Harlan. And I was still going back and forth to Boston, sometimes to play Wally's, and I was kind of just barely paying my rent for the first year or two. And then from playing with Mark Turner, I met Joshua Redman. I had run into Joshua Redman way back in the day at the New School, and he had also gone to Harvard. So I knew from Josh's example that it was possible to juggle these two lives. He did it sort of differently than me. He's the son of a famous saxophone player, Dewey Redman, and he grew up with this organic kind of ear-based relationship to the music. He heard it not necessarily directly from his father, but for the albums that were in his house all the time. And he continued to learn in that fashion through college and practice and play as I did with all the great musicians that were attending Berklee School of Music at the time. And I realized it was possible. He got into Yale Law School. I think he might have graduated even summa cum laude from Harvard. So I knew it was possible to do these two things, courtesy of him. But we had no personal or musical relationship until I started playing with Mark. I think he heard me play with Mark, and he called me one day and said, "Hey, do you want to play a session?" That's what we call a little rehearsal. And he came over to my house, and I called my friend Reuben Rogers, the bassist and a drummer, and we played. And the next day he called me and said, "Hey, do you want to play a gig with my band?" And I played a couple sort of initial gigs with his band. They went fairly well, and then he asked me to join his band. He was starting a new band.
Well, I was going to just ask that because this is sort of a question that I often wonder about the jazz world, because there's so much permeability between bands and players coming and going. And so if you come in as the pianist, what happens to the former pianist? That kind of thing.
Oh, good question. So most of the time, you are called for a gig because the normal pianist can't be there because he has another commitment, perhaps with his own band, perhaps with another band.
And was that Brad Meldo at the time?
In Josh's case, Josh had famously had a kind of what became an all-star band with the best musicians of his generation: Christian McBride, Brian Blade, Brad Meldau in the early 90s. And that was kind of, Josh was coming out, and it was also Christian and Brian and Brad's coming out. And then that band lasted a couple of years. And then Josh, for many years, had a band with a different pianist, great pianist named Peter Martin. And then he had, right before I joined Josh's band, he had a little bit of a reunion with Brad and Brian, and they'd made an album together. And they had toured that album, but Brad was embarking on his own career, as was Brian, so they weren't available to actually be the full-time band of Josh. So Josh knew he had to find a new full-time band that could tour in supporting this album and future albums. So in that case, I didn't really replace any existing pianist. You could say that I replaced Brad, but Brad wasn't really available. So it was time for him to find some new, presumably a little bit younger guys that would be available for him all the time when he needed us. And that's what he did. So I joined the band along with Ruben, a guy who I'd met at Berklee College of Music at age 18, and Gregory Hutchinson, who was a little bit older and more experienced than us. So we toured with that band for 4 years. Sometimes it is rarely, but occasionally true that you, for example, somebody's sick, can't make a gig, you get called to sub for them, and the band leader decides he likes you better than whoever was there before, and he just stops calling the last guy and starts calling you. And
does it come down to that? Is it calls like that, or are there contracts that you sign?
Very rarely there's a contract. For example, Jazz at Lincoln Center, when I played with Wynton Marsalis, you do sign a contract when you join the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra and you join Wynton's band for a certain period of time. So I replaced a guy who left in the middle of his contract. So I was called for that gig because the guy who had the gig before me had a falling out, decided he didn't want to fulfill his contract. They needed to find somebody to fill the last 6-7 months of his contract. So that was me. But that is rare. That's the only time in my life that I've ever had a contract or filled in for somebody with a contract as a sideman or a collaborator in somebody else's band. Most of the time, there's no contract. There is an expectation that you are in the band, and it can be very awkward if you are replaced. But it's pretty rare that happens. There's very rarely formal auditions. For example, I had an audition for Josh Redman's band without realizing I was auditioning for his band because he said, "Hey, let's play some music," and usually that's how you are kind of auditioned without anybody saying that you're being auditioned.
Yeah. Well, it just made me think of a question I was thinking of bringing up later, but it might fit in now around, from my perspective, seeing your career take off, it just seems like it's been soaring really since you left high school. I remember actually, I was living in Taiwan, and my mother sent me the paper clipping announcing that you'd joined the Josh Redman band. And I thought, my God, he's made it big. But have there been setbacks, challenges that kind of have rattled you or questioned what's going on? For sure, of course. I would say that there are kind of two sets of challenges that are unrelated. So, one is when a band comes to an end, for whatever reason. It could be your own band. Guys are no longer available to play with you that used to be available to play with you because their careers have gotten so big that they're in demand for all these other bands, for example. Or you have a falling out with the band leader of a band that you're playing in. Or it's just time to move on. People move in separate directions. Mm-hmm. And the reason that this is so challenging is because it's very much like a marriage. When you're together with a band for a long time, you spend an awful lot of time with those people, and it can be even more time spent with those people than you spend with your significant other, whoever that might be in your life. And they become, if not like wives, they become like brothers. And then when you have to part for whatever reason, no matter who's the boss in the situation, it can be painful, especially if there's some kind of issue that comes up, whether it's musical or personal. So I think we all have faced those sets of challenges. It's just part of this work that we're in. It's the flip side of the beauty of it, because when you make great music with people, it's an act of love, and you show your love for them, and they show their love for you, and you find a synergy of minds. I mean, at the highest level, bands are operating subconsciously. The interaction between the different members of the band is happening at the level of the instant, the millisecond
much faster than the conscious mind can keep up. So you're finding a kind of mind melding experience that allows the music to be created, so to speak, by the product of four minds working in harmony without any awareness of self. At the highest level, you're not aware of the distinction between the four selves. And that's a love-making, literally like an act of unity, a love-making kind of act. So it's very, very intimate. And it's not something that we talk about all the time, but we all know it. We all feel it. So, you have a love bond with all the people you've made great music with. And when those love bonds, have to end for some reason, that's painful. So that's one set of, challenges. Another, or there's also gigs that you think you were going to get, but you didn't get for whatever. That goes into that category of like, sometimes that's an ego thing, but like, oh, somebody else got this gig that you think you're going to get. Or somebody else is, well, I'll say this for the second set of challenges. When I was young, there were people that I hoped I would play with that I didn't get a chance to play with for whatever reason. So that's a certain kind of social disappointment, be ego related or not. The second set of challenges are business challenges because, this music is unpredictable and everybody's career, the vicissitudes of everyone's career are unpredictable. And every year you have unexpected ups and you have unexpected downs, and you never really know where your money's going to come from and how much is it going to be, and how many gigs you're going to have that year, and how many gigs you're going to have in the next year, and how many CDs you're going to sell, and which aspects of your career are going to be more successful, which less, which musical relationships are going to flourish, which are not. It's very, very hard to predict all these things. And from the outside, of course, it looks like I've had a successful career, and I think I have, if I take the big picture, and especially if I consider that I never even thought it was possible, and especially if I consider the number of people that try to have careers in this music and in all forms of music and give up. So I feel extremely fortunate to be part of this jazz musical family. Also, I never imagined I would be accepted, because the fact is, this is African American music that I play, and the fact that great, African American masters of this music have always not just invited, but been passionately, socially intimate and involved with non-African members of the community, like non-African American musicians such as myself, is a beautiful thing about America and a beautiful thing about the Black community and about this music. So anyway, that's another topic. We can return to that. So I feel very fortunate to be where I am today. Nevertheless, the business side of the music is very challenging, and these days it's even more challenging because when I came up, as I mentioned before, the 90s was a kind of re-flourishing of the music. Yeah. A renaissance, so to speak. We weren't really aware of that at the time. There was some propaganda about it, but we were too young to appreciate that. Older musicians talked about that, and now I see how the music industry has changed since the 90s, and I realize actually the 90s were great because of the demise of the record companies, because of free music and the streaming, and there's much less money being put into the jazz world. There's just less. There's no corporate money anymore. A lot of the money that does exist is nonprofit. It's filtered through nonprofits like Jazz Lincoln Center, which is doing an amazing job. But somebody like Joshua Redman used to sell 200,000 copies of his record. Now he sells 5,000 copies. So that's a radical change. Now, fortunately, people still want to go hear Joshua Redman play, and fortunately, live music is still popular. And this is true for hip hop artists and pop and rock artists as well. Live concerts are still doing well, but jazz, we benefited from that tour support that the record companies were giving us. We benefited from the promotion of these albums, which doesn't exist anymore. And also the market, because of the internet, has been flooded with people making their own albums. It's so cheap and easy to make your own album and throw it out there and do a whole bunch of self-promotion on the internet that it's very hard to cull through the mass of jazz music that's out there, music that calls itself jazz, and find the good stuff. So there's very little quality control compared to how there used to be. The quality control back in the day was directed by the musicians themselves and by the A&R people who looked to the musicians to find out who was the next great guy. So if you were an A&R guy and you were working for, I don't know, Warner or Polygram or whoever, Sony, you would figure out like who's in the band of Miles Davis. Well, let's go back even farther back in time. If you were Blue Note, you wanted to sign a pianist. How are you going to choose Herbie Hancock? Well, he's Miles's pianist. If Miles chose him, he's the best guy. So you're going to give Herbie Hancock a record deal. And in fact, Herbie Hancock was the best guy because Miles chose the best guy, and everybody wanted to be in Miles's band, and Miles chose Herbie. So Herbie's going to make some great records, and sure enough, he did. And he's going to be the great star that he became because Miles chose him. And there was quality control exerted from the top on an artistic level, and the industry paid attention to that because they saw that actually these great guys who played with these other great guys themselves became great masters and popular figures, and they could make money off of that. Now there's no such process. There's no quality control, so it's much trickier. So I would say the business side is a certain set of challenges, and negotiating the changes in the business has been particularly tricky for me. And then the social side of becoming super intimate with people that maybe you don't play with forever.
Well, I wanted to see if we could go back to that social side of things for a second, because when you're talking about that, you really describe this kind of unification that occurs during a performance or a loss of self in the performance, and where you're just sort of four beings merging into this simultaneous creation of something. Can you say what does that feel like while you're in it? Because it's such a sort of emotionally laden, sensitive thing to watch or to experience in the audience. What's going on for you during that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I could say about this. The first one I would like to say is that the power of the music from an audience perspective at a live show really comes from this, in my opinion. There's a feminist philosopher of art named Braha Ettinger who I discovered, who has a very elaborate and deep theory that is based around the idea of self-fragilization. So the self becomes more fragile. The sense of self dissolves a little bit in an experience of art, whether you're the consumer of the art, the visual purveyor of the art, listener, or the producer in the case of musicians, because your concentration needs to be so total, and the input-output relationship, stimuli coming in. Remember, I'm trying to, as a pianist playing in a quartet, for example, I am trying to, as best I can, hear and react to every single note that is being played by the saxophone, the bass, and the drums, and myself at every single millisecond. So I'm trying to process this inordinate amount of information. Process is not quite the right word because it doesn't feel like I'm processing anything, but I am. Everything that I play is a reaction to everything that I just played and everybody else is playing at that moment. So, and great jazz is made by multiple people playing together with that kind of necessity and mindset. So there's no room for anything except for that kind of input-output process. I don't want to make it sound too dry, because it's not dry, because there's an emotional content to it coming from everybody as well.
Developmentally, if I can just pause for a second. Developmentally, you talked about your process in high school, developing a jazz vocabulary. That sort of seems like an essential foundation of development for an improviser. But at the level that you're describing there just now, how do you practice or prepare for that?
So this is what separates, the women from the girls, the men from the boys, the professionals from the students, and the geniuses from the merely great and the great from the really good, is the ability to play with others at a high level and react to everything that's going on in the moment and make extremely good decisions spontaneously, intuitively, and give the music your emotional content and react to everyone else's and support everyone else and show your love and respect for what everyone else is deciding to do in the moment. And to achieve that level of flexibility and flow in the present, in the now, so to speak, is something you can only get good at by doing it a lot, all the time, which is something that I kind of intuited when I was in college, and that's one reason that I just tried to play with people as much as I could, as opposed to sit in my practice room and, try to learn more vocabulary. Mm-hmm. It's a rhythm section skill that you can only develop by doing it a lot. And I saw that also with Ruben. When he came to Berkeley, he wasn't the best bass player, but everybody liked him and he had a good feel. And so he always wanted to play, and he was full of energy, and he got so much better so fast because he was just constantly playing with people. And I realized that, it was the same thing for me at the New School, that the more I played, the better I got. And you're not necessarily aware of that from day to day. You need to have certain building blocks, but it's integral. There's no way to practice that except by doing it. But I think that you also have to be aware of your strengths and weaknesses as you're doing it, or be able to reflect upon them. So one way to do that is you listen back to recordings of yourself playing in bands, and you realize when you made a bad decision, or when there was an opportunity that you missed, or when you weren't thinking fast enough, or when you sounded good on these kind of fast songs but not on the ballads, or your accompanying is better in this minor key than in the major key. You have to do a post facto analysis of your strengths and weaknesses in order to improve on your weaknesses. And as a teacher, that's super important to get students to do that. But really what everybody needs is a lot of experience, and particularly experience playing with people that are better than you. So that's very much like a sport.
Yeah.
So there was an interview I read with Mulgrew Miller, one of my favorite pianists who sadly left us recently, and he was talking about a conversation he had with Tommy Flanagan, and he said he asked, Tommy Flanagan is another masterful pianist who was about 20 years older than Mulgrew, and Mulgrew asked Tommy, what separates the greatest pianist from the rest? And Tommy said, they just spend more time playing the piano. So there's a certain kind of truth in that, which is just the more time you spend at your instrument with, in my opinion, with people, the better you're going to get at this skill set. Mm-hmm. And there's no substitute for that. It's a social music.
I was wondering if, I know some of the musicians like Sonny Rollins and Herbie Hancock too, I think they did get into Buddhism and meditative practices, I think, to support, maybe cross-train for this kind of experience you're describing. So, yeah, there's a few jazz musicians that famously are devotees of a particular school of Japanese Buddhism. I guess it's called Nichiren Buddhism. They do a lot of chanting, and it has some different names, but it's a very contemporary Japanese school of Buddhism that is, from what I've understood of it, from reading Herbie and talking to some people like Buster Williams who also practice it, it's pretty divorced from the traditional Indian concept, or even like a Nepalese Buddhism. So there is some meditation, but there's a lot of chanting for things that you want. So it's almost closer to like a self-help kind of tradition, or even a Scientology tradition, where you're visualizing, or a sports visualization, in my opinion, is something close, where athletes do this, where they visualize their goal, and they visualize themselves achieving that goal, and then it helps them to actually arrive at that goal. And Herbie in particular gives a lot of credit to his Buddhist practice, and I think there's no question that it's really helped him in his life a huge amount. But I would also note that Herbie was the best long before he became a Buddhist. Yeah. He was the best guy at playing the piano at the highest possible level in all these bands with all these masters. He was the most in demand, and he was already highly successful as a band leader as well before he became a Buddhist.
So if he gives himself credit, if he gives Buddhism credit for training him, I think it deserves the credit that he gives it for training him for life. But as far as for training him to be a great musician, I would say, well,
he was already there.
He was already there, as was Wayne Shorter, the other very famous Buddhist practitioner. Yeah. But I have the utmost respect for them as humans and musicians. I mean, they are truly two of the most magnificent humans on the planet, and they left me in tears meeting them and listening to them on many occasions. So I'm not taking their claim seriously, but I just offer that up too. I think that the skill set that musicians acquire is very specific. Jazz musicians in particular, and especially rhythm section players, it's very, very specific, and it, in my opinion, can only be acquired by experience.
Given that you're kind of an ambassador for the jazz tradition, or one of the ambassadors now on the world circuit, how concerned are you about the viability of the art form, given the kind of business dynamics that you were describing, given just the kind of the attention span of most people listening to music these days? Do you have any concerns about it? Do you have any advice around it for people? Because I know I talk to people and they say, jazz seems interesting, I just don't understand what's going on. It just seems like it's sort of chaotic, or there seems to be, even within the tradition, like historically, there's been kind of somewhat of a divorce or a dissociation between the musicians or the music being created and the audience. Where at one point it was a dance music, and then it sort of became more and more alienated from the participation of the audience. And I think there's been more of a resurgence lately with musicians, even like yourself sometimes, where you play a pop cover, do a cover. I know on one of your albums you do a really interesting version of a Stevie Wonder tune, Isn't She Lovely? But where is the art form going in terms of its audience? And
there's a lot of good questions in there. I'll try to take them apart.
Yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a snowball.
Jazz musicians have always improvised with the pop music of the day. I mean, that is something that every single jazz musician has always done, from Louis Armstrong on, and even before, Jelly Roll Moore, all the early pianists, even, people like Scott Joplin that, were kind of pre-jazz.
And even there's this whole repertoire of standards, right?
The so-called standards that became part of the jazz musicians' repertoire were popular songs of the day that started out as musicals, in Broadway musicals. So the entire jazz improvisation tradition has embraced this idea that we're going to play these familiar melodies, which also have familiar harmonies attached to them, and we're going to improvise with them, bringing our own melodies to these familiar harmonies and varying the original melodies to create something new and hipper than the original. Because this is part of the issue, going back to it being African American music, because the popular melodies of the day were mainly, white American, popular melodies of the day, and they, at least from a rhythmic standpoint, no matter how genius they were from a melodic, harmonic standpoints, they were made hipper by the jazz musicians of the day. They were just made funkier and better and more danceable. So, but this tradition of paying attention to pop music is a long-standing tradition and has never stopped even for a second. I mean, all through the 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, jazz musicians up until the 21st century have always played pop music of the day. And that continues not just with me, but with Brad Mehldau and everybody that you might know, that you might have heard of as a contemporary jazz musician, does this, plays in a totally new way, sometimes a barely recognizable way, pop music of the day. And they do it not primarily to appeal to a new audience or to appeal to a young audience, but, I mean, there's a whole school of jazz melding with hip-hop today. So it's like jazz musicians and hip-hop musicians are actually making music together. And it makes sense because the original hip-hop path was improvisational. It was freestyling. So, there's a deep improvisational element in all black music, and jazz is just one of many African American musics that have always kind of been talking to each other. So there's a dialogue between jazz and the other forms of black music. There's a dialogue between jazz and all the popular white music of the day. And and now in different countries of the world, you have jazz musicians, international jazz musicians, improvising with the popular music and folk music of their native traditions, right? So you have Indian musicians playing Indian jazz. You have, Latin American musicians playing Latin jazz. Brazilian guys playing Brazilian jazz. You have American guys playing Brazilian jazz. You have Bulgarians playing Bulgarian gypsy jazz. You have, you have this. This is a very fruitful and I would say never-ending, fountain of material that's in the pop world, because it's the music that you grew up with. It's part of what goes into your ears, and it's natural that you'd want to kind of use that for your improvisational art. So that part of it, I think, is not new, and it will always continue, and it's constantly being refreshed. There's amazing music being made today, consisting of jazz musicians having fun, taking apart the various elements of all the different strands of pop music of today, and hip hop and rock, everything. So that part, I think, is alive and well and kind of safe for the future, and I have fun with it, and everybody that I work with also has fun with it. So I'm not worried in the sense that jazz will always survive, because it's the highest form of musical art. I mean, it's certainly the highest form of improvisational art that we have in the music world, and there will always be people that spend their life trying to get better at it, because it's just such a high art form, in the way that writing is, not in danger of dying. There will always be amazing writers, because there's just so much amazing work, to read, and that will forever inspire you to try to create work. So there's such a body of magnificent jazz and improvisational music that there will always be musicians inspired to play at a high level. And there's no shortage of amazing musicians playing now that are just as great as most of my heroes. The audience attention span thing is a real problem, and in my opinion, it started long ago. I mean, with music videos, because all of a sudden the quality of the music wasn't necessarily the thing that determined the hit value, because so much money and effort was put into making the video. So, and now when you're young, and you see this with kids all the time, they're paying attention to the videos. They're imitating the videos, the dancing of everybody in the videos. And with the internet, video is even that much more important. So people's ability to just sit, close their eyes, and listen to something is depressingly weak. Mm-hmm. Weaker than it's probably ever been in the history of humanity. So to oral music, or oral sources that are non-visual, music that does not have a visual component, is in trouble. And this is something that we have to, the education system is the only thing that can help us with this. We have to teach kids not just to appreciate jazz, but just to be able to sit and listen to something, for 5 minutes at a time. Now, live concerts have a visual element, so they're not going to suffer as much. It's fun for people, even who don't understand jazz, to go to jazz concerts. And this will bring us back to the second part of your question. Every day that I play a concert, there's somebody that comes up to me and says something on the order of, wow, I never knew I liked jazz. But I kind of get it. Like, I could see you guys were talking to each other, and I didn't really understand what you were doing, but I could see there was a conversation, and it just, I really liked that one song, and I was dancing, or my eyes were closed, and I just felt all these emotions. You always reach new audience members who are surprised that they like jazz, and you might not reach them in the same way. Each person's going to get reached in a different way. Some people, they want to move. So if you play, I mean, in my opinion, the greatest jazz has always made people move, even if it's not a music for partner dancing the way it maybe used to be back in the day, with the Lindy Hop. If I look out in the audience, at a concert that I'm playing, or even a concert of my friends, and I'm sitting there, people are moving their head, they're bouncing around, they're snapping their fingers, they're tapping their foot. That's a dance, That's music that makes you feel good. If it's making your body move and shake your booty in your seat, that's enough. That's enough to reach people. It doesn't have to be like a show, everybody like in a club. It doesn't have to get people out of their seats to move people. on a rhythmic standpoint. And then other people, you're going to move them with pure beauty. You know, you're going to move them in the way that they'll be moved by a ballad in a pop ballad, or the way they'll be moved by a classical piece by an orchestra. You know, you're going to move them with the emotional, you know, aesthetic beauty that has always been a part of, you know, moving people through music. And I would argue that stimulating similar parts of your brain just gets stimulated when you see something beautiful. I think there's a kind of aesthetic experience that is powerful for people, and it probably has a lot in common with other modalities. So you're gonna, I played this past weekend, Friday and Saturday night, and I had 3 or 4 of these conversations with different people, and in one case, I was talking to 3 people at the same time who were all saying completely opposed things about what they liked about the concert. Mm-hmm. And one person liked the exact same thing that the other person didn't like. And it was fascinating for me, and that's a part of my life, and it's most amazing to me how many times I get asked a question like this. So, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah. I know the concert was amazing. I loved it. It was magnificent. But I have this question, like, so did you memorize all of those notes? Or like, was there some improvisation, or was it all like written somewhere? But I didn't see you using any music. Or can I see the music that was sitting in front of you? Like, are all those notes written there? But I didn't see the drummer use. There's a very basic lack of understanding of
what you're doing.
Even the bare that jazz is improvisational music amongst even people that consider themselves fans of jazz and people that go to hear jazz a lot. And that's I think our fault as artists. We also have to be educators to a certain degree and make sure that people have at least a little bit of appreciation for how we do and what we do. So what we do, how we do what we do. So I admire people like Wynton for taking on that role, and I try to do it a little bit myself. And I think, there's a lot of progress to be made just with having pre and post concert conversations with people, whether they're formalized or informalized. But we need to teach people this is really America's greatest art form. I strongly believe that. And it's also one of the, most democratic and most kind of like racially diverse aspects of our society. The jazz family is a kind of magnificently post-racial little community of people that embrace, African American music. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's only post-racial in the sense that like there's no racial tension anymore, and there was, of course, yep. But basically, at least in New York City, there's no racial tension in this family. It's a multiracial family, and everybody's just coming from the same place, as far as I can see. And that's magnificent, and the country has a lot to learn from that. So I think we can do a much better job promoting this music and teaching people about this music as a country. Maybe not with Trump as president, but...
Yeah. I'm not going to pick that bait on this talk. We are coming towards the end of a long stretched hour here, but do you have any maybe closing advice for people that might be interested after listening to you talk now? What would they do to go out and start to develop a greater appreciation or ability to? Really, it's an ability to appreciate. Does it just take an album and maybe sit down and?
Thanks. I think it needs to be said that there are some people that don't like jazz. And I don't think it's our job as jazz musicians to reach everybody. But I will say that most of the time, the people that don't like jazz had a legitimately bad experience with jazz, in the same way that you can not like oysters because you ate one bad oyster. As soon as you have that one bad oyster, you're going to hate oysters. Your body has evolved to make you hate oysters, so you avoid that bad experience. It's too bad, just bad luck. So if you walk into a jazz club and your friend takes you to hear some jazz and it happens to be not that good, you might be conditioned. No, jazz, don't like it. And the sad truth is there is a lot of bad jazz out there in the world. Jazz is a very difficult music to play well. It is played well by a very small percentage of the people in the world that call themselves jazz musicians. especially if you don't live in New York or New Orleans, the chance that you've encountered bad jazz is very high. Now, if you're lucky enough to live in New York or New Orleans, chances are you do like jazz because you've been to some jazz clubs and you've heard some good jazz. So if you don't live in New York or New Orleans, I would recommend you take a trip to New York or New Orleans and go to one of the best jazz clubs in those places. Maybe you can ask somebody, what's a good night to go? Who's playing? Somebody who knows. And have an experience of live jazz music played at the highest level. And unfortunately, it's not accessible everywhere. It is accessible in other parts of the world at jazz festivals. So there's a few famous jazz festivals. Hopefully, if you could go to the Montreal or Umbria, or hopefully you'll find some good jazz there. But that's not a guarantee either. So that's one way to have an experience of a great concert live. The other thing I would say is if you're someone who, for example, has a long attention span and you like, for example, listening to classical music, start with Miles Davis. That's what I tell people. That's the way I learned. Start with Miles Davis. Choose a Miles Davis album from the 50s or maybe early 60s. Some of the highest art form, some of the highest art that my jazz family has produced was produced by Miles and people that worked with Miles in the 50s and 60s. Start there. If you like it, find another Miles album. If you don't like it, but you might like something related, choose an album by somebody who played with Miles Davis. John Coltrane, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter. The list is long. So if they play with Miles, guarantee they're good. So try something by one of those guys. Start there, and you'll eventually branch out into the whole history of the music, and it'll take you into the present day.
And the past.
Yeah, and you'll go in both directions.
Yeah. All right, so all roads do converge with Miles.
I would say so.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's been wonderful talking to you, wonderful getting to listen to you and catch up this way. Just want to really appreciate your time and generosity here. If people want to find you, what's the best way to, is it your website, aarongoldberg.com?
Yeah, well, people want to find out information, about me, what I'm up to, maybe where I'm playing, those kind of things, biographical stuff. My website is aarongoldberg.com. That's true. And there's a Facebook page, like an artist page that supposedly should have also that kind of information on it. I have some Facebook personal pages. You could try to friend me there, or you could send me an email. My email is aarongoldberg99@yahoo.com. I will tell you straight up, I'm not the fastest responder to emails. I have an inordinate amount of read emails. I won't tell you exactly how many. Embarrassingly large number. But that is my email, and I would be happy to hear from you. Any questions or want to say hello, that's a good way.
Good. And maybe one more thing. A recent album or two, the last album came out was called The Now, right?
Yeah, the last album that came out is called The Now. There's another album that's been made. It's finished. It doesn't have a definitive title yet, but it should come out, I would say, probably in the spring of 2018. So, yeah.
And we really didn't have time to get into it, but these musical relationships you've had are now 20 years going, right? With your bass player, Reuben Rogers, and drummer, Eric Harlan. So these albums are not just like a new band all the time. It's just forming. It's really this evolution of this core group.
So that is correct. I've played with Reuben and Eric for 20 years. I've also played with another set of great guys that I still play with, Omer Avital and Ali Jackson, also just as long. And I actually just started a new band. So this next album has has new guys on it, new collaborators, but they're actually not new because I've also known them for 20 years. So a magnificent bass player named Matt Penman, right, and a magnificent drummer who I actually grew up listening to named Leon Parker. So he's a drummer and a body and vocal percussionist as well. So I've been playing with Matt and Leon, and we recorded. So all these bands are now coexisting, and I hope to play with these guys for the rest of my life.
Fantastic.
All of them.
Well, I look forward to seeing you live next time you're in your hometown.
Thank you so much, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
Awesome. Hang with you. Thanks a lot.